One morning in 1947, one of the most chilling scenes was found by an innocent passerby. But who was the victim? And also, who was able to carry out such a heinous act with so much skill and precision? Will we ever be able to find out the full truth? Hi everyone, I hope you're all having a great day so far. I can't believe we managed to make it to episode 10 of True Crime Time already. It really seems like I started this series yesterday and I'm having so much fun doing it. So to be able to make it to episode 10 is really crazy to me. Thank you so much for the support. It really inspires me to continue to do the research into these cases so I can tell you all about them. In today's case, we're going to be talking about what may be one of the most famous unsolved cases in history, especially in the West, and that is the Black Dahlia. I'm sure you've heard about this case in some capacity, but hopefully we can learn even more about it together. This is the first time I've covered a cold case on this channel, so it was definitely interesting to do something different again. But it was also very stressful too. There's so many gaps and inconsistencies that we may never be able to fill, but hopefully one day we can solve this case. As always, before we do get into today's video, I just want to give my usual disclaimers. This video contains topics which may be distressing to some viewers. These topics include murder and abuse of a corpse. There may be further topics included which I have missed here, so viewer discretion is definitely advised. We're going to be covering some heavy topics today, so if that's something you don't think would be suitable for you, please feel free to click off the video and hopefully I can see you again when we're discussing a topic which might be more suitable for you. I would also like to quickly mention that all of the information we'll be talking about today has come from research which I have conducted through sources which are readily available on the internet. No disrespect is intended with this presentation in any way, it's all for educational purposes only. I try to get all of the information correct to the best of my ability, but as always, I do apologise if there's any mistakes at all. On the morning of the 15th of January 1947, at approximately 10 AM, Betty Bersinger was taking a walk with a young child down Norton Avenue in Los Angeles when she noticed something ghostly white in the grass. She walked over to take a look at the object, which she initially believed was a shop mannequin, before quickly realising she had stumbled across the most grisly scene imaginable. There, lying posed like a mannequin in the grass, was a young, naked woman who had been completely cut in half. Even though her body was covered in a number of wounds and had extensive bodily mutilation, all of the blood had been drained from her body without a single drop of blood left at the scene. This, of course, left the body looking extremely pale, which gave her that mannequin-like appearance. Absolutely no blood, nothing found. So that obviously indicates that this crime initially took place away from the scene of where the body was found. Upon realising what she was seeing, Betty immediately contacted police, who arrived on the scene to begin investigating and to work out who this unknown woman was. Police described the victim as a white female, aged in her 20s, with light brown hair which had been dyed black, and blue eyes. She was 5 foot 5 inches tall, weighing around 118 pounds, and had badly decayed teeth. Sadly, the killer had slashed her face into what is called a Cheshire smile. So if you don't know what this is, it's when the corners of the mouth are cut up to the ear into like a smile kind of shape, kind of like, I guess, a Joker kind of mouth, if you could put it that way. It's more easy to understand what I mean if I say that. Pieces of flesh from her right breast and the upper left thigh had been removed, and further investigation noted that some of her internal organs, including her intestines, had been removed and placed underneath her buttocks so that she was actually lying on top of them. She also had a large 4-inch laceration from the belly button area down towards the pubic area, as well as a large number of crisscross lacerations over the pubic area. And it was noted that the killer had actually removed her pubic hair by hand also, so they'd like scraped it off. It's really weird. And I just want to give you a massive warning. If you want to look into this case, all of these pictures are very, very easy to find. So if you are very sensitive to this kind of thing, I would definitely avoid searching into this case. If you want to do some research, please be aware that they are very, very easy to find. And of course, from this description, you can see they're very unpleasant to look at. So yeah, I just wanted to give a warning for that. The autopsy concluded that she had died from hemorrhaging caused by blunt force trauma to the head. Her skull had not been fractured, but there was bruising present on the front right side of her scalp, as well as some bleeding within her skull. It was determined that the incisions which cut her body in half were performed after death, as there was very little bruising present in these areas, and obviously if you are cut whilst you are alive, even if it's just before you die, your body will start bruising and trying to, heal itself basically. So that means that she must have been already dead because the body literally didn't react to it basically. Her body was also reported to have been covered in gasoline, and this is thought to have been to, remove any form of evidence that could be on her, because if you don't know, gasoline, it dissolves proteins and stuff. As part of her autopsy, her fingerprints were taken, which were then sent to the FBI for examination. Luckily, due to this, police were actually able to identify a match due to an arrest she had had in 1943 for underage drinking. And the unknown victim, who had originally been called the Black Dahlia by the media up to this point, was finally able to claim her identity again. She was identified as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short. The press were absolutely disgusting throughout this whole case, and reading how awful they were, and unapologetically awful throughout the whole case, was so upsetting, and it was just disgusting. They initially somehow caught wind of the murder before police could even arrive to the scene, and were taking pictures of her and the scene, and that obviously included her body. And maybe that's why they're so easy to come by, these pictures online, because the media literally turned up before anyone else could even get there. I don't know how they found out about this, but they were taking pictures of this poor girl's body. And to make things even worse, they were somehow able to find out that the Black Dahlia had been identified as Elizabeth Short almost straight away. And I don't know how they managed to do this. It makes me think that there was someone internal that was letting them know, which, screw them, that is absolutely horrible. But because of this, the media straight away contacted her mother, Phoebe Short, who you can see in that picture there. And Phoebe was living in Boston at the time, so they contacted her via telephone. And they told her that her daughter had won a beauty pageant, and tried to get as much information about Elizabeth out of Phoebe that they possibly could, before just dropping the horrific, terrible news that her daughter had actually been brutally murdered and she hadn't actually won a beauty pageant. It's awful. It made me so upset. So upset that the media just dropped that on her. It's disgusting. How dare they do that? Absolutely no respect for this poor woman in any way. To find out like that must have been absolutely horrific. And the media actually continued to be absolutely despicable throughout the whole case. They painted Elizabeth out to be a sex worker, and she wasn't, and they just seemed to label her as one for some reason, and I don't know why, but it's still something that is actually widely misspread about this case. It's one of those incorrect facts that people still believe is true, and it's not. She was not a sex worker. There's nothing against sex workers, but I think it's just disrespectful to label her as one just because she was. I think it's honestly just because she was an attractive young woman. I genuinely think that's what it was. So now I'm going to go on to the life of Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth was born in Boston, Massachusetts on the 29th of July, 1924, to parents Phoebe May Short and Cleo Alvin Short Jr. She was the third child out of a total of 5 daughters. Her father was a sailor for the United States Navy, and her mother was a housewife. In 1930, her father's car was found abandoned at the Charlestown Bridge, and it was assumed he had ended his life by jumping into the Charles River below. And this was because he had lost most of his life savings in the 1929 stock market crash, which, if you don't know, begun the Great Depression. So this meant, with her father gone, her mother had to begin working as a bookkeeper in order to make money to support the family and keep them all afloat. But Elizabeth was sent to live with family in Miami, Florida, throughout the winters at the age of 15, and this was because she had undergone lung surgery due to severe asthma attacks and bronchitis. It was said by doctors that it would be best for her to actually avoid any cold climates to prevent any possible problems for her respiratory system. So that prompted her temporary moves to Miami each winter for the next few years of her life. And during this time, it's reported that she worked as a waitress. But once again, the family was shaken up in 1942 when her mother received a letter. And this letter was actually an apology from Cleo, her father, Elizabeth's father. And from this, it came to light that he had not, in fact, taken his own life back in 1930. He'd actually run away to California, leaving behind his wife and 5 daughters to fend for themselves throughout the whole of the Great Depression. How selfish. What a selfish man, honestly. But despite this, Elizabeth still decided to relocate to Vallejo is that how you say it? Vallejo in California to live with her father when she was 18 years old in 1942. But this didn't last long, as she moved out again a few months later in the January of 1943 due to getting into arguments with her father. After leaving her father's house, she started working as a civilian clerk at Camp Cook, which I found was an army camp near Lompoc in California. Some sources say that during this time she lived with an army sergeant who had abused her. Some sources say that during this time she had lived with an army sergeant who had abused her while they lived together. But this was only a few sources, and I couldn't find out who this man was. So once again, I don't know whether it's just one of those pieces of misinformation. Like, I feel like there's a lot within this case that are just pieces of misinformation that are spread around. So please, as always, take it with a grain of salt, like I always say. During mid-1943, Elizabeth left her job at Camp Cook and moved to Santa Barbara in California. But shortly after her move, in September of 1943, that was when she was arrested for underage drinking, when she was caught drinking in a local bar. And these were the fingerprints which were actually used to identify her body later on when she was sadly killed. This is why we were actually able to find out who this poor girl was. But because of this arrest, she was made to move back to live with her mother in Massachusetts by the authorities. But in reality, she moved back to Florida and only occasionally visited her mother. It's said that even though Elizabeth was arrested for underage drinking when she was a teenager, during her adult life, she didn't actually drink at all. And it was also said she didn't smoke, which, due to my knowledge, this is quite unusual, as it was really popular for all genders at this point in time in history to actually smoke. So she didn't do anything like that. I also didn't know really where to mention this earlier, but based on the timeline, you may have realized that what we've just talked about was actually going on during World War II. And during this time, in December of 1944, Elizabeth actually met and quickly became engaged to a man named Major Matthew Michael Gordon Jr. And he was an Army Air Force officer. But sadly, on the 10th of August 1945, Matthew lost his life in a plane crash. And this was only around 22 days before the war would actually come to an end. And that was really, really sad to find out about. So she lost her fiance so close to the end of the war. And I'm sure that absolutely just broke. It must have broken her heart, honestly. I can't imagine how horrific that must be. It must be awful. After the death of Matthew, it seems like Elizabeth just bounced around a lot. It doesn't seem like she had much of a permanent home after this, and some sources even report that she was homeless during this time. It's widely reported that Elizabeth wanted to become a Hollywood actress, but she didn't seem to have much luck with landing any leading roles. And I'm not sure why this was, but I think she was such a beautiful lady. Honestly, she is so pretty. She did hold a job as a waitress and spent 6 months living in a rented room behind a nightclub in California in 1946. She moved to be near a man named Lieutenant Joseph Gordon Fickling, who it seems she had taken quite a fancy to at the time. Although this relationship sadly didn't last, and Joseph actually moved to North Carolina for work. After this, it's said that Elizabeth took a trip to Los Angeles, and on the 8th of January 1947, just 7 days before Elizabeth would be found dead, she had begun talking to Robert Manley, who was also known as Red due to his red hair. Red was a 25-year-old traveling salesman who was already married for approximately 2 years at the time of him meeting Elizabeth, but this didn't stop him from attempting to win her over and even inviting her out for drinks. These drinks then turned into the two of them staying together at a motel for the night, after which Red states he dropped her luggage off at the Los Angeles bus station the next day, which was the 9th of January, before taking her to the Biltmore Hotel, where she claimed she would be meeting her sister. He states that he left her there on her own at 6:30 p.m. on the 9th of January. After this point, it's unknown what Elizabeth did for the next 6 days of her life. But sadly, as I mentioned previously, Elizabeth would be found dead in the grass next to the sidewalk at approximately 10 a.m. on the 15th of January 1947. 9 days after the discovery of Elizabeth's body, police would receive a really suspicious envelope. This envelope contained a letter made from cut-out newspaper clippings stating, "Here is Dahlia's belongings." Within the same envelope, they found Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, photographs, some names written on pieces of paper, and also an address book. This address book wasn't actually her address book, and it had the name Mark M. Hansen and the number 1937, which I believe is a year, embossed on the front. But apparently it was with her at the time that she had died. And Red even reports having seen this address book in her purse when he was with her shortly before her death. The contents had all been doused in gasoline, which made it impossible for police to obtain any forensic evidence from the contents. As I mentioned before, gasoline is a type of solvent. And even though DNA testing wasn't currently a known thing at this time, it was still possible to obtain evidence from means such as fingerprints. And of course, if you don't know, fingerprints are made up of sweat. And sweat is a protein. So if you put gasoline on that, it's gonna, because it's a solvent, it's going to dissolve those proteins, which obviously would then completely get rid of the fingerprints. So if you remember, the address book was labeled with the name Mark Hansen. And of course, after they found this address book, they located this guy and they brought him in for questioning, but he wasn't actually considered a suspect as he had not seen Elizabeth since the following November. He stated that Elizabeth must have just taken his address book from his desk. Mark was said to be a nightclub owner and a landlord who had tried his hand at a number of unwanted sexual advances towards Elizabeth, but he wasn't convicted as a killer. Several more suspects were questioned in relation to the contents of the letter, but all of them were ruled out fairly quickly. Approximately 75 men, which were found in the address book, were contacted in total, but most claimed they had only known Elizabeth for a short period of time and had absolutely nothing to do with the murder. It was also believed that the murderer may have been a surgeon due to how precise the cuts were. You know, she was cut in half, and this cut was really clean, basically. So they believed because of this, it was likely that it was someone with at least some surgical knowledge. The blood was completely drained, wasn't it, as well? Which, I mean, I've never done that, but it seems like something that would be very difficult to do. Like, very, very difficult to do. And because it was believed that the person who did this may have been a surgeon, it resulted in the police asking at a local medical school, but nothing came back after conducting several interviews there. Throughout the investigation, there were seemingly quite a few people who made false confessions for the murder, which I don't understand why anyone would want to possibly try and confess to a murder that they didn't even commit. It makes no sense to me. Why would you want that? It's really sick and messed up that you would possibly confess to something you literally didn't do, especially something like a murder. I don't know, do people want to be that to be infamous that badly? It genuinely makes no sense to me, but you can find a lot of newspaper clippings of times where people have actually falsely confessed, and these can be found in the FBI archives. The archives are actually very easy to find. If you just type in this case, you can find the archives on the internet very easily, and here is one of them. You can see you might not be able to read it from there, but if you want to read into them, there's a lot of like newspaper articles on those archives. A lot of the initial recordings, you know, when they go to the scene and they write down what is there, you can see them on the FBI archives as well if you wanted to check that out. So we're now going to talk about some of the possible suspects of Elizabeth's murder. So the first and most obvious one was Red, or Robert Manley, who was the last known person to be in contact with her. It's said that Red's report of the time before her murder was constantly changing throughout the years, as he retold the story to people and police. At one point he stated that she was feeling unwell and that he dropped her off at the hotel. Another thing he changed was that she said that she had an Italian boyfriend who was extremely jealous, and that she also had bad scratches on her arms above the elbow area. But obviously, these can't be confirmed or anything like that. He was originally arrested for his possible connection due to being the last known person to see her. During this time, he reportedly states that he regrets cheating on his wife that day because it got him into this trouble. And I remember, I don't have the exact quote, but I remember him seeing somewhere that he said that he's basically not going to do it again because this is what happens when you go out with random people, kind of thing. I don't quote me on that. He said something like that. I don't have the quote with me. I should have got the quote. But he said something like that, and it's like, dude, just don't cheat on your wife. Like, it's not that hard. Police seemingly concluded that because he had no medical training, he would not have been able to, or have had the knowledge to, be able to cut her so neatly like it was done, and therefore he was released with no charges after completing and passing 2 lie detector tests. But of course, nowadays, lie detector tests aren't admissible in court, as it's quite easy to lie on them, at least in the UK anyway. I don't know about America. But apparently back then, it was enough evidence and he was allowed to walk off free. I'm guessing they probably did a lot more investigations into him than what they're actually putting out there in the open, but it didn't seem like they looked into him that extensively. I don't know. I couldn't find that much on his, like, what they looked into him, but I feel like they should have looked into this guy more. I don't know what it was, but I feel like he did those lie detector tests and two of them came back as passing. He passed both of them. And I think they were just like, oh, it can't be this guy then. It's also stated in some sources that later in life, Red suffered a mental disability that led to him hearing voices, but I can't confirm or deny if any of these reports are true or not. I just wanted to throw that in there. It's not really relevant, but I just thought I'd pop it in there, a little bit of extra knowledge on Red here. So now I'm going to move on to what most people believe to be one of the main suspects. And this suspect was American physician George Hodel. He first came onto police radar shortly after the search for Elizabeth murderer began, when police were searching for local physicians. And during this, he was actually initially interviewed there. But this suspicion grew even deeper when in 1949 he was accused by his own daughter of essaying her and even impregnating her. And his daughter even claimed that her father, George Hodel, had killed Elizabeth. But for some reason he was completely acquitted of this essay, and I really don't know why. It's just so upsetting to see when this stuff happens. Like it seems so obvious that, you know, like why did he get away with this? It's awful. It seems to happen way too much. But this did lead police into taking a deeper look into him, which resulted in them finding out from at least 8 different witnesses that George and Elizabeth did know each other in some capacity, and some of those witnesses even claimed that there was some kind of relationship between them in 1946, which is a year before her murder. So he does know her to some extent. What extent that is obviously differs between witnesses and sources, but you know, they definitely knew each other. During this time, his home in Hollywood was also electronically bugged by police so they could listen into his conversations, and they heard George saying, quote, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary." End quote. His secretary did die shortly after the death of Elizabeth, and this death was ruled as a suicide, but who really knows? So, I don't know, maybe she knew a little bit more than he wanted. George died in 1999, never have been formally accused or charged of the murder of Elizabeth. But his son, Steve Hodel, who was a former LADP homicide detective for 20 years, did begin to investigate his own father due to suspicions he had about him, and he has since released several books into his suspicions. His suspicions all began when he came across a photo album in his father's house, which when looking through the album, he was shocked to find 2 pictures which looked very similar to Elizabeth Short. It was said that George was known to be a ladies' man, having numerous wives and girlfriends throughout his life, as well as a huge number of children to all of these different women. So it's believed it may have been possible that he had met Elizabeth at some point, as they were known to be in the similar scenes in LA around the same times. Going back to his upbringing, it seemed he did have a somewhat difficult life, and he had what was reported as an affair with his professor's wife and actually got her pregnant when he was just 15 years old. But in reality, this is grooming. He was groomed by this lady. He was still a child. He was 15 years old. So I don't possibly think you can refer to that as an affair, but all the sources which cover this call it an affair, which I think is completely incorrect. That is not an affair. That is grooming. But he did go on to receive his medical degree in 1936, going on to become a very successful doctor and living in one of the richest neighborhoods in LA at the time. So this means he had at least 11 years of experience as a fully qualified doctor at the time of Elizabeth's murder. Another possible killer is said to be a man by the name of George Knowlton. Seeing as this is a second George that we're mentioning, I'm going to just refer to him as Knowlton. So not much is known about Knowlton and his life, other than the fact he lived in Los Angeles during the same time Elizabeth was murdered. It was actually his daughter Janice who claimed her father was the killer, just like what happened with George Hodel. His son and daughter claimed that he was the killer, and with George Knowlton, his daughter also claimed that he was the killer. She claimed this after beginning to experience recovered memories after undergoing therapy, which she was receiving for her depression. Within these therapy sessions, she began to recall witnessing her father murdering Elizabeth after he was in a relationship with her for some time, where she was staying in a makeshift bedroom in the garage. She then claims he cut Elizabeth in half in the sink and made her help him to dispose of her body, as she was still a child, if you remember. So he made his own child apparently dispose of Elizabeth's body. But she also said that Elizabeth was a sex worker who was involved in a child trafficking ring, but there's been absolutely no evidence to support this, and if it's made up, it's honestly such a horrible and disgusting thing to make up. So this maybe is what some of those rumors come from, although this has come from a lot later on. But I don't know, it just, to me, it doesn't seem very credible. I don't like this one personally. I know some people really think like this is it, but personally, I don't like this one. But apparently police did take it serious enough to take some time to dig up the garden of her childhood family home, but they didn't find any evidence there. Janice later died due to an overdose of prescription drugs. There are quite a few people who have been considered suspects for the murder over the years, but honestly, from my point of view, and this is just my opinion, I feel like a lot of those they're just not credible. There've been some famous people that have been considered suspects as well, and I'm not even going to mention them because I think a lot of them are just completely made up with absolutely no basis. I really do. And maybe there's some more evidence which hasn't been released to the public, which we're unaware of, which might make them a bit more of a stronger suspect. But without that, and with what is currently available, I honestly find it really difficult to come to a conclusion. So the final suspect I'm going to talk about today is a man named Leslie Dillon. Although, like I mentioned, they're definitely not the last suspect, as there's so many suspects out there, and like I said, some of them are a lot more believable than others. Leslie was originally said to be considered one of the police's top suspects at one time, but of course, like all the others, it was eventually dropped. But some people do believe that he is still the one that did it. Leslie was a bellhop for a hotel in LA. I couldn't find out which one. I did try looking into it, but he was a bellhop. But there are also reports that he briefly worked as a mortuary assistant at some point before this job, which is where people believe he could have possibly been able to obtain the knowledge to be able to so neatly cut Elizabeth in half and also drain her blood so well. And like we mentioned before, during embalming and things like that, you would have to drain someone's blood. So, I don't know, maybe that's how he got the knowledge. From available sources, it seems like Leslie was 25 years old at the time of the murder of Elizabeth and took on a number of different aliases throughout his life. It's also reported that Leslie did know Mark Hansen, which is the owner of the address book, which was sent to police when Elizabeth had died. Some people believe that Leslie committed the murder at the request of Mark in the bedroom of a local motel. As the owner has said, he found one of the rooms covered in blood and fecal matter, but just decided to clean it up rather than report it, as he was also in trouble with the police for unrelated crimes. The police apparently did tap Leslie's phone, but no incriminating evidence was ever found from them doing this. So we're coming to the end of the case now. These are the only suspects I'm going to talk about because I feel like these were the ones that were the most substantial to me, the most likely ones. And if you want to, you can obviously go and look into all of the others. Like I said, there's some famous people. I think one of them was a movie director, which I didn't look more that deep into because I just didn't think it was a substantial piece of evidence, honestly. And the whole murder investigation just seemed like such a mess to me. There's so many dead-end leads and like possible suspects which led absolutely nowhere. And in the end, like I mentioned, no one was ever found guilty of the murder of Elizabeth Shaw. And this case still remains a cold case to this day, 77 years later. I don't know where else to put this in, but it's said that Elizabeth's father even refused to attend Elizabeth's funeral. And her mother was the only one who turned up to identify her remains, which I found was so sad. Her mother has been that poor lady has been through so much. It's awful. I honestly, I feel so bad for that lady. She was put through what I can only describe as hell, honestly. She was called, if you remember, she was called by the press and just told about her daughter's death. Basically, she just had it dropped on her. And then she had to go and identify her daughter's mutilated remains. I cannot imagine how traumatizing, horrific that must have been. Honestly, it's completely unimaginable. The amount of pain she must have been in is just unimaginable. And like I mentioned, I found this case really confusing to research. There's just so much going on, but all of it just leads seemingly nowhere. And honestly, I don't think I'm able to come to a personal conclusion of who did it, who I think did it. I feel like the three suspects that I personally mentioned were the ones that I feel are most credible. But out of those, I don't think I could come to a personal, like, conclusion of who I think did it. Like, I can't say, yeah, I think this person did it. There's just not enough information and too much kind of hearsay and stuff. The evidence is just very, very weak for all of the suspects. And I feel like it's very likely that it's just someone completely unrelated. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch today's video. Hopefully you've learned something new about this case. Do you have an idea of who you think did it? If so, I would love to hear your thoughts and theories on the case in the comments below. Also, if you did enjoy this video, I would highly suggest giving it a like and also subscribing to my channel so that you don't miss out on any future videos. As always, I just want to say a huge thank you once again for the support for this style of content, both on here and on Twitch. And if you want to see more of me, you can find me over on Twitch, where I hang out with you guys live several times a week. So I definitely love to hang out with you more over there. But until then, if you would like to find out about more true crime cases, you can find a video suggestion that I think you may like on the screen right now, so definitely check that one out too. So with that, I'm going to end this video here. As always, remember to be kind to yourself and to others, and I will see you again very soon. Goodbye!